So to get us started on that, we're going to hear about the power of the mind in medicine and longevity from a couple speakers. I'm going to introduce them both to you right now. Max Rangeley is a trustee and director of the Cobden Center. He's led a think tank founded by a British MP since 2014 and served on boards in London and Brussels. He focuses on emerging technologies, organized the first ever blockchain summit at the European Parliament in 2016. Max has lectured at leading universities and advocates for integrating radical longevity into public policy. Here's Max Rangeley. Yeah. And then speaking with him will be Dr. John B. Alexander, who entered the U.S. Army as a private in 1956 and rose through the ranks, retiring as a colonel of infantry in 1988. From 1966 through 1969, he commanded Special Forces A teams in Vietnam and Thailand. I'm not sure what that is, but that sounds pretty heavy. After retiring from the Army, Dr. Alexander joined Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he was instrumental in developing the concept of non-lethal defense. During his time in the Army and following, he researched the power and potential of the human mind. He's the author of several books, including The Warrior's Edge, which discusses meditation, intuition, visualization, and psychokinesis as researched by the U.S. military. Dr. John B. Alexander.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And yes, so thank you very much for coming this morning as well to this talk on the power of the mind in medicine, which I find to be really one of the most fascinating areas of medicine and longevity. And I'm actually working on a book at the moment called The Power of the Mind in Medicine, which will be published by Spring and Nature next year. And we're inviting many of the top experts around the world on the placebo effect, hypnosis, psychedelics, meditation, from many of the top universities like Harvard and Stanford here, Imperial College in London, to each write chapters on some of the most important topics. And this will be the first academic volume of its kind in The Power of the Mind in Medicine. And because it's published by Spring and Nature, that will go out to medical schools around the world to be used for teaching. So for those of you who are from universities, you can access that through your Spring and Nature subscription from next year. And so today there's two of us speaking. And as the intro mentioned, as well as the work that I'm currently doing for this academic text, John researched a lot of this during his time in the military, which had some other fascinating implications. So we'll start off then with one of the key areas of the power of the mind in medicine that demonstrates this effect, and that is the placebo effect. And I know for these types of presentations, what they say is don't put too much text up, just a few words and then do the talking. I would usually agree, but for this, I actually think it's important that you can see some of the nuances of these studies, because some of these studies that we're going to be looking at today are absolutely incredible. And the key thing to understand with the placebo effect is that it does not just alter your perception of pain or whatever it happens to be. There are actually very real physiological and neurological effects of the placebo. There's been several studies into the placebo and Parkinson's disease, for instance. And one of the interesting early ones from De La Fuente Fernandez et al. In Nature Neuroscience, for that one, they injected Parkinson's patients with pure placebo, so just a saline injection, so no active ingredients. And this activated the release of dopamine in the striatum, that's the part of the brain damaged in Parkinson's, between 50 and 75% of the level of the most used Parkinson's drug. And this has actually been replicated several times since then, so quite extraordinary. But the effect of the placebo effect is not just in the brain, it's also in the body as well. And so, for instance, the immune system is a classic example. There's been a number of studies on this as well. One of the interesting early ones from Adler et al. Gave people placebo with a hepatitis B vaccine, and they were told that this would boost their immune system, and indeed, there was on average a 63% higher antibody response compared to the control group. So if we think for a moment about what's going on here then with the placebo effect, as I noted previously, placebo does not just change how people report pain or whatever it happens to be. It changes how the brain processes things, and it changes what's going on at a physiological level as well. One of the best researchers in placebo is Benedetti, and him and his team have done a lot of brain scans when placebos have been given. And so, for instance, with respect to pain control, indeed there is reduced activity in the parts of the brain that process pain, but also there's a substantial release of endogenous opioids, and the dopamine systems are also activated. So in other words, the brain is releasing its own painkillers. But tying into this, you can actually give someone naloxone, so that's an opioid blocker, and it will actually block the placebo effect for most people. But we'll come to hypnosis in a minute. Hypnosis can actually act through slightly different pathways. But there is also a flip side to all of this. And so when people are in a negative mental state, it can have converse effects. So there was a study 30 years ago in The Lancet, that's one of the top British medical journals, and they found that people under chronic stress, their wound healing was 40% slower after surgery. In fact, it took them 24 days rather than 15 days on average to recover after surgery. Now, what I'm going to do today is for each of these areas that we look at with the power of the mind, I'm going to give some suggestions for how you might incorporate something into your daily routine to tap into these aspects of the power of the mind. And for placebo, what I would say is probably the best method is actually visualization. There's been many studies on the positive effects of visualization. So for instance, for something like this, if you did have surgery, you can visualize yourself healing for a few minutes every morning. But even you could just incorporate it as part of your daily routine in the morning. Just visualize yourself healthy and happy. And that alone can have profound effects. And that can help you tap in to these same pathways in the brain that are activated by placebo. So we'll move on then to the next area of the power of the mind in medicine, and that is meditation. And these studies are of particular interest from a longevity point of view, actually, because there's been numerous studies of meditation demonstrating its effects on reducing systemic inflammation. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the research that inflammation is a very important biomarker of aging. In fact, it's often been termed inflammaging. And so you can see here two of the studies on meditation and inflammation. But also then that study by Jacobs et al., they looked at telomerase. Of course, telomeres are another biomarker of aging. And participants who had just done a 3-month meditation retreat showed a 30% increase in telomerase activity. So quite profound, really. So this is really, meditation should really be something that you should adopt as part of your daily routine for longevity. So the question then is, how can you incorporate meditation as part of your morning routine? There are, of course, thousands of different types of meditation, thousands of books written on meditation. I would say for this, the easiest is probably to start with one of the simplest and, let's say, one of the core forms of meditation used for thousands of years, and that is focusing on your breathing. So just take a few minutes every day. 20 minutes is ideal, but even as little as 5 minutes can be effective. And just focus on your breathing. And what you'll find is your mind will naturally start to wander off. And when it does, just bring your mind back to your breathing. Bring your mind back to your breathing. Just do that over and over again. And you will actually build up your focus and your concentration over time. But also, you will start to see many of these health benefits that have been proven to be the case with meditation. So meditation is really a relatively simple thing to build into your morning routine. Moving on then to hypnosis, and of all of the different areas of the power of the mind in medicine that I'm writing on at the moment for this book and that we have different chapters on, for me I'd say hypnosis is perhaps the most interesting of all, actually. And my co-editor for this book is Dr. John Butler. He is a lecturer in neurology, and his specialism is actually hypnosis. And about 15 years ago on British television, on Channel 4, which is one of our largest networks, they did live surgery on television without anesthetic using hypnosis. It was a 2-hour show where they did this live surgery. That's 2 photos. And actually, it was my co-editor, Dr. John Butler, that was the hypnotist that did that live on television. So it's really, and there have actually been thousands of operations done without anesthetic using hypnosis. But even if we move back a little bit from actual surgery without anesthetic and just look at pain control, one of the best meta-analyses by Montgomery et al. Found that in the vast majority of people, there are some substantial reductions in pain when hypnosis is used. But actually, for many people, the effect is even greater than morphine. Now, that may sound maybe even slightly far-fetched to say that, but if you look at the reports of the thousands of operations done without anesthetic using hypnosis, it includes amputations, it includes very complex dental surgery. So yes, it is in fact a very real phenomenon. But moving on from just the anesthetic and pain control aspect, if we look at hypnosis for healing after surgery as well, there's an interesting study by Genandes et al. Now, as I've noted here, the sample size was only 18 for this, but nevertheless, this has been replicated a number of times. And after ankle fracture surgery, people were hypnotized to heal faster. And many of, let's say, the softer metrics showed well over 50% improvements in functional recovery, swelling and inflammation, and so on. But actually, even using radiographic analysis for the bone healing was 41% greater in the hypnosis group. So again, hypnosis can have very real and very powerful physiological effects. So how then can you implement hypnosis as part of your daily routine? What I would say is the easiest thing to do is find somewhere, sit down or lie down, somewhere comfortable, and to start with, just do what's called a progressive relaxation. So the easiest thing is just to start with your feet and just relax and then move up through your legs. Just relax your whole body part by part, moving upwards, and take maybe 1 to 2 minutes to do that progressive relaxation. You then should be in quite a pleasant state. And at that point, just count down from 5 by going 5, deeper and deeper, 4, deeper and deeper, 3, deeper and deeper, and so on. And when you get to 0, you should have put yourself into a mild hypnotic state. And at that point, you can give yourself auto-suggestions. And this doesn't need to be complex. It could just be, I'm strong, I'm healthy, I'm happy, whatever it might be. And auto-suggestions can actually be very powerful at any time of day. Many people use auto-suggestion for self-control. But when you've induced a state of self-hypnosis, those auto-suggestions will go straight down into the subconscious mind. So just as when you do surgery without anesthetic, you essentially program the subconscious not to experience that pain. You can do the same yourself with self-hypnosis, as I've just described. Now, if we move on then to the flip side of all of this, that is nocebo. So nocebo is when you give someone something inert, but you tell them that it's going to cause pain or harm or something along those lines. And just like placebo, nocebo can also be very powerful. Benedetti, who I touched on earlier, has done a series of fairly basic examples of nocebo where you give people just an inert cream and tell them that it will cause pain. Not only is there a substantial increase in reported pain, but actually there are measurable increases in cortisol, CCK, and other physiological metrics for pain and anxiety. But also, at least 2 studies have investigated chemotherapy. They gave people nocebo chemotherapy. In other words, it was completely inert. There was nothing in there. And the majority of people had measurable GI upset and cortisol elevation. And 30% of people actually experienced hair loss and chronic nausea of the kind that you would experience with chemotherapy. So nocebo, just like placebo, is also extremely powerful. So how then can you guard against this? Can you build something into your morning routine? I would say the most important thing is to maintain a positive frame. When there's this constant doom from the news, from the government, from whoever else, it tends to put you in a negative mental state, and that makes you more susceptible to disease and so on. By maintaining a positive frame, you become a lot more resilient to this. But I think one of the best ways of doing this is to build some type of gratitude practice into your morning routine with these other things I'm talking about. This could just be 1 to 2 minutes every morning when you do your meditation and so on. Just have gratitude for things in your life. It could just be as simple as just being alive. But all of us here lead very fortunate lives compared to most of the people in the world. And so just taking 1 or 2 minutes a day to have gratitude for that can be very powerful and builds resilience against this non-stop negative programming from the media and elsewhere. And so we move on then to psychedelics. And some people would say that psychedelics is more of a pharmacological intervention as opposed to, let's say, a pure power of the mind phenomenon like hypnosis. But I would argue actually psychedelics, they allow you to tap into certain parts of your mental faculties that make them different from just most pharmaceutical drugs. And Carhart Harris has been one of the best researchers into this. You may well be familiar with some of the amazing research looking at psychedelics for treating depression, but also PTSD. We find that just 3 MDMA sessions results in 2/3 of people no longer meeting the criteria for PTSD. And actually, when it comes to these PTSD studies with MDMA, many of those people had already been through years of failed treatments for PTSD. So by the time they got to this stage, they were some of the most resistant people. Many people at this stage tragically commit suicide. So that's really incredibly powerful. I think another thing that differentiates psychedelics from other pharmacological interventions, let's say, if you compare them to antidepressants, for instance, if you were to rate your happiness level on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is you're going to commit suicide, 10 is you could not be happier, if you were at a 1 or a 2, you might take antidepressants to get you to a 3 or a 4 or 5, let's say. But if you're at a 7, you wouldn't take antidepressants to get you to an 8 or a 9. But with psychedelics, in general, even if you're living a very happy and fulfilled life, if you're a 7 or an 8 or even a 9, you can generally take psychedelics to boost that even further. Now, I said I'm going to give people some advice for how to build these things into their routines. For psychedelics, all I can really say is obviously just to keep it legal. I think there's certain states and cities in the US where it's decriminalized. You can investigate that for yourself. There's the Netherlands in Europe and some other places as well. But that's the only advice I can give on this really, is just to keep it legal. And so we move on to breath work then. And one of the key things with breath work is you don't need to learn some very complicated form of pranayama developed in India 3,000 years ago. Really just a few minutes a day of, for instance, coherent breathing, just slow, steady breathing can have profoundly beneficial effects for depression, sleep, heart rate variability, and many other things as well. But another interesting form of breath work, which I've done in the past as well, is Wim Hof breathing. That comes from a guy in the Netherlands called Wim Hof. And that involves taking 30 deep breaths, and then you exhale completely, and then you hold your breath for as long as you can on the exhale, and then you repeat that 3 or 4 or 5 times. And in essence, it's strange to describe, but it actually allows you to tap into your nervous system. And research done on this at one of the top universities in the Netherlands, they took one group where they trained them in Wim Hof breathing, only for about 10 days, and the other group had no breathwork training. And they injected them all with E. coli endotoxin. Now, this was inert, so they're not going to die, but it still does result in the same very bad flu-like symptoms. And the control group, of course, had the terrible flu-like symptoms, but the group that had been doing Wim Hof breathing were able to control their immune system, so they suppressed the innate immune overreaction. And as the researchers pointed out, this overturned decades of medical dogma that the autonomic nervous system and innate immunity are beyond conscious control. So how then can you incorporate breath work into your daily routine? With this one, I would say the easiest is actually to learn from YouTube videos. So you can just go into YouTube and type in box breathing, for instance, a simple form of breath work, or indeed Wim Hof breathing. And you can learn it from YouTube videos. And there are videos that will count along as well with the breaths. So it really makes it very easy. Of course, if you want to go to a breathwork course, that can be very useful. But there's so much you can learn on YouTube these days. It really is incredible. And so the penultimate slide then from me today is on epigenetics, something which has been talked about a lot. There's been a lot of research over the last generation or so. And one of the landmark studies on this was by McGowan et al. In Nature Neuroscience. And they looked at 25 suicide victims. 12 of them had suffered abuse as children. 12 of them had not. And they found that the 12 that had been abused as children had increased DNA methylation of the NR3C1 gene, among other things. And that's critical for cortisol feedback regulation. In other words, that group found it more difficult to get out of negative feedback loops of stress and anxiety when those negative feedback loops set in. And of course, it will often tragically lead to people committing suicide. So the question is then, if you suffered something in your childhood, I mean, we all have to some degree, or some other traumatic event during your life, which will have affected you at an epigenetic level, or even increasingly there's evidence for if something happened in your parents' life or even grandparents. The question is, are you stuck with this for the rest of your life? And the answer may well be yes, if you don't do something about it. But as we've seen today, there are many things that you can do to tap into the power of the mind. Most, if not all, of these things we've talked about today will have some type of positive epigenetic results. But I touched on meditation earlier, where people did a 3-month meditation course. But if we look at long-term meditators, people who have meditated for more than 10 years, they are on average 7.5 years biologically younger at an epigenetic level. That's using the Horvath epigenetic clock, a fairly established way of measuring this. And so, again, incredibly powerful. So if you do want to, let's say, reprogram yourself as much as is possible at an epigenetic level, I think the key thing is to look at all of these areas that I've talked about today and look at ways for integrating them into your daily routine. Again, I've talked through some of the methods that you can do that. It can be as little as 10 or 20 minutes a day to incorporate all of this into your daily routine. And final, very quick slide then. So in the book, The Power of the Mind in Medicine, I'm currently writing a chapter with my co-editor, Dr. John Butler, on looking at the neurological commonalities between all of these things I've talked about today. So really looking at this perspective that the placebo effect, hypnosis, breath work, they're all studied separately, but actually are they all tapping into some single force, the power of the mind, let's call it. And so in this chapter, we look through all of the different effects and the neurological commonalities between them, the parts of the brain that are activated. Now, I don't have time to go into this now. I'll hand over to John in a second. But you can take a photo if that's of interest. And the book, The Power of the Mind in Medicine, will be published next year by Springer Nature. And I will hand over to John now for his part of the talk.
Good morning. I guess what I'm going to cover is maybe more of a history lesson. I might mention that the subtitle to Reality Denied is Firsthand Experiences with Things That Can't Happen But Did. And what I'm going to talk about most of them right now from the military perspective. As I said, I was in from 56 till 88. I mentioned Vietnam. After Vietnam, the military was broken, and particularly in the Army. I mean, and we recognized that it was broken. And we had General Scheimeyer became Chief of Staff of the Army, and he was willing to allow us to explore some kind of wild and wonderful areas. And there was a guy by the name of Bert Subelbein, if anybody knows this. He was the commanding general of Intelligence and Security Command, and we were doing some wild and wonderful things, and I'm going to cover a number of those. We also had something called Task Force Delta. I want to differentiate. This is not the, quote, Delta Force that you know of we call door kickers. gee whiz factor there is the guy who created it. Colonel Charlie Beckwith was actually in Ranger School with me back in 1958. But our objective was to find out what's the difference that makes a difference. In other words, there's lots of things going on, but what are these that can we pick out and make operational? I usually start, in fact, all of my briefings with this, just so you know my personal bias, because I recognize I am seriously biased and have been involved in all of research in all of these technologies and applications. I'm going to go into remote viewing in just a minute, ions, near-death studies, psychokinesis, we'll cover that, interspecies communications, and I said, even this, cryptozoology. And in my view, the key factor that crosses all of these is consciousness. And where that leads us is really quite controversial and emerging today. Have worked, as I said, in a lot of areas. My doctorate was under Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, if anybody knows near-death study. But the point that, and I think what Max was just mentioning about the stovepiping, you look at this and we look at each of these things independently. And these groups, even though they have certain common factors, tend to not interrelate near as much. As I said, I have dealt with near-death with shamans all over the world, not going to cover shamanology, but remote viewing, I think, is the place where I wanted to start. Don't you're familiar with this. From military perspective, we're talking about psychic spying. And yes, we had the people who are doing it. Joe McMoneagle there is fairly famous. You can see him on a number of programs. He was remote viewer 001, known as best of the best. And Ingo Swann was sort of the godfather. Ingo was one of the three people that was at SRI originally. He was an artist, but he came up with the whole concept of a mental matrix, which became a teachable skill. I want to have a caveat emptor there. There are lots and lots of people out there teaching it. Like I say, caveat emptor, there's only two people that I would personally recommend, but just be careful because a lot of people have popped up in the field. But what you see in the side, if anybody's been to Livermore, the experiment that I'll mention first was that Joe had gone in. This was done at SRI with Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. And they had a target, and they gave him send somebody out. And this is what he drawn. Now, if anybody's been to Livermore, coming from Los Alamos, yeah, I've been to Livermore too. But what you notice is you see there that row of trees is very definitive. Now, Joe did not know the target. He did not know anything about the area, had never been to Lawrence Livermore before, but was able to accurately describe these things. Now, I've dealt a lot at very high levels, the National Academy of Science and National Research Council, and when you talk to the scientists, they say, well, you know, how can you do, what's the theory behind this? And for both us and the Soviets, one of the things they did was to monitor what getting back to the bad old days, what the Soviets were doing here. Everybody thought, well, this is some kind of low electromagnetic wave of some kind that we can understand. The problem with that is when you start perturbating time and you get into precognitive and retrocognitive remote viewing. But while we couldn't answer the question, and there's a problem theoretically, is we had an operational capability. I'm going to go into one. This is a picture that Joe did, one of a number of sketches. What had happened was that we had, they brought in overhead satellite photography and said, can you tell us what's in this building? And he goes, no. So he did his remote viewing thing. He says, first of all, there's a number of submarines in there, but one of them's really big, and it's quite different from anything we've seen before, and it's double-hulled, and the tubes are forward of the sail, and there was a whole number of things they found. So the response was, when they reported it, they said, well, okay, what do you got? Well, our boat builders, submarines are called boats, by the way, looked at it and said, nonsense. If you built something that big, when it went to depth, it would crush. Okay? About 6 months later, he also said, by the way, in about 6 months, there's going to be a trench built, and this thing will go out. Sure enough, in time, skies parted, the cameras came on, and there was the Typhoon-class submarine. The point is, we had all of the information, but was basically rejected. We had any number of those where when you, in retrospect, you went back and you found out you had the information, but it was tended to be rejected. Wanted to bring up a friend of mine, Bob Monroe, and again, in the technology, if you're familiar with something called HemiSync, he runs the Monroe Institute and did journeys out of the body. This is related to remote viewing because our people, we actually sent them to the Monroe Institute for training. It was very interesting. What HemiSync is you take one, it's called a binaural beat. You put one frequency in one ear and a slightly different frequency in the other, and then drive the brain. Bob happened to have been a double E, electrical engineer by trade, and said the problem with meditation generally is you sit there and you try to meditate until you find, what's the right brain wave and all of that. He says, I'll just drive you there. And so he was using this system to drive, and he would say that he didn't have all the pegs put in when he was born because he kept getting out of the body, but it was developing people who could do that. Psychokinesis, and this is going to have impact, I think, in many, many areas. We're talking here metal bending. The one on the far side there. This was one of the most amazing things, and it was an N of 1. But we used to teach the metal. You may have heard of metal bending parties, and that does work. What happened is you take at the end 2 matched forks and hold them up. And in this case, what happened is I was at Xerox Institute at INSCOM Lubin. Had the audience, by the way, is all mostly colonels and a few generals and that. But all of a sudden, this thing drops over a full 90 degrees, which I didn't see. But they yell, and then while we were all watching, that fork came back up straight, went back down, and went to about 45 degrees where it is. Now, the reason that I have that, and actually recently took that picture, the guy who did it, it really scared him pretty badly. And he said, gee, I wish that hadn't have happened. But the point is that this mind over matter happened, and we were able to do this and demonstrate with very senior people. And you can see in the other picture, that's just some of the crap we have. But some of these pieces are very, very heavy. And this is in what we call macro PK level. Anybody interested, I'd recommend Bob John's work. Bob was the dean of the School of Engineering at Princeton. They did stuff in micro PK that quite surprising. Another area we explored was what's called primary perception. There was a guy by the name of Cleve Baxter. Cleve was a polygrapher. In fact, he developed the system that's still used in zone comparison for a polygraph. And he started an experiment. Like many of these things, you find them accidentally. He had a big plant, I believe it was philodendron, and he says, I wonder if I take water and I pour it on the roots, how long is it going to take for the water to get to the leaves, which he thought. And as a polygrapher, you know, GSR, galvanic skin response, is one of the things. So he put the clamps on there, and he's just measuring it, but he left it. And he had it wired up to his polygraphs he was watching. And he just noticed periodically they were getting these squiggly marks. And he goes, what is this responding to? And then he finally found out that, well, it was a plant that was responding to thoughts of things that were going on in the area. So he took out his lighter and he went over and burned the leaf. And you saw the leaf, quote, faint. You would actually get a physical response. Then it got to where he got over there and he thought about burning the leaf, and the leaf would respond. Go, well, don't know. So he moved on from that, where we got involved. He was using oral leukocytes, specifically the white cells from the mouth. And so I had Cleve under contract, and we replicated the experiments there at Fort Belvoir, where I was operating out of at that time. But the notion here is that if somebody would donate white cells and would be at some significant distance, I mean, miles and whatnot, and yet you were getting the white cells responding to the emotional state of the individual. And you go, really, how can you do that? I have the National Research Council. This was one, we were doing all of these things, and Max Thurman was the vice chief of staff of the Army. He had asked the NRC to come in and look at, what are you doing? What are these things? I mean, you know about remote viewing and some of that. What makes sense? So I had recommended to them we ought to go to Cleve's place, which we did. And so they arrived. And, you know, if you're going to do a demonstration, you want to know that it's working today, not that it worked yesterday or not. So I went in and I donated white cells. I got there before everybody else. Donated my white cells. So it's sitting, hard to explain, quite a ways away with a number of walls in between. And frankly, forgot about it. And what happened was that Cleve was one of these guys, when you ask him what time it is, he would give you the history of chronometers. And just going on and on. So finally it became my turn to talk. Well, all I was going to say is, okay, that's the basic research. I've independently replicated it. So I start talking, and about 90 seconds later, his assistant comes roaring in and says, what happened about a minute ago? I said, well, that's when I started talking. And he went over, what you saw was my white cells had just gone. Well, the response to it. Now, I can tell you that standing up before the National Research Council and telling them the universe is not built the way they think it is an emotionally experience. But one of the things that happened, here's what we do is you take the white cells, these are in a shielded container some distance away. And it was interesting because we did some, other experiments. I said, Cleve, being a polygrapher, they would wire me up and we would try things. Now, I should mention, again, we're talking the bad old days, and counter polygraph was one of the areas that we were also interested in. And what I found was I could beat the polygraph. I couldn't beat the white cells, and allowed them to explore and get into emotional areas. That was quite interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with NLP or neuro-linguistic programming. I had Richard Bandler and John Grinder under contract, along with Tony Robbins. This was before Tony was famous, okay? And Tony and John would work together. Now, what NLP was developed for was Bandler and Grinder had looked at, they were doing their doctoral dissertation, and they looked at Virginia Satir, Fritz Perls, and Erickson, And the question that they had really was, why is it that these people get tremendous success when they're doing it, but people who work with them and do derivatives don't seem to get the same effect? So the question was, what's the difference that makes a difference? Now, one of the things that was different here, now, of course, they're looking for, excuse the term, breaking people, a therapeutic modality. What we had was a very different question. The reason we were looking, well, for several reasons. But one of them was we had really good people, and it was, how do we make them better? I have altered states, by the way, if you want to follow up, Richard's life is on there, and I'm in the movie, but so here's some of the projects that we did. We worked under Project Jedi, and this was a pistol shooting one. Haven't got time to get into long detail on it. But what we did is we took the Army Marksmanship Unit and a separate group. I had the Army pistol champion, the inter-service pistol champion, and their boss, and we were able to work with them and find out, again, what is it that makes these experts so good, and come up with a theory. Now, one of the areas I really have to give Tony Robbins credit, came up with what we call the success model. What everybody had done in the past is you put the target out for 25 meters, and then you start shooting, and then until you hit the target, and then try to remember that. Our approach was different. We put the target right here. I mean, you could almost move the thing. You could not miss the target, what we call the success cycle. So instead of learning and trying to get failure and work in, we started with absolute success and moved it out. Well, one of the things I also want to mention is it was interesting. We worked with NSA. Again, bad old days, and communication was by Morse code. And the Soviets moved at about 60 groups per minute. We had nobody who could keep up with them. And so what we did is we found what we called who are the best of the best, and we were able to look at them. One of the things we found out, for instance, was we were looking for the wrong things. Everybody thought that what you want is really smart people, which you do. You also needed to be able to do some typing. But our problem was they would go to school for almost a year, take a break, and go to the unit. By the time they got there, they had lost the skills. They had to be retrained. What we found out was, and this is using NLP techniques, was looking for the wrong skills. What you really wanted was an audio file. The question that should have been asked is, if this predictor was, what kind of stereo equipment do you have? And we found that the people who had extraordinary hearing had it. Now, one of the things we did, and I mentioned Andrei Kostelut here, who was working, this was an interagency issue. And Andrei was the only CIA guy who was captured that we ever got back alive. And he mentioned that the cavalry came over the hill just at the last second, and happens right there. And what we were able to do using these NLP techniques is change history where he could tell what went on that day as if he had never been kidnapped. Now, you've got to understand, kidnapped like that is really emotionally significant, but he was able to tell the story in a way that could beat the polygraph. It was really quite significant. Quickly moving on, this was not direct, but implications of prayer and intercessory prayer, even when the individuals don't know about it. I recommend Larry Dossey, we're not in great conditions at the moment, but on healing words. But one of the things that doesn't get talked about, Larry does mention, is negative prayer, that you can impact people negatively. But the most interesting one, I think, was Leonard Libovici. And this was a most unusual session. What they did is they had about 3,400 cases of people who had blood infections. And they had a group do prayer. The problem is, where it gets really significant, the infections had happened between 4 and 10 years ago. So it was, and when they started doing intercessional prayer and then went back and checked the records, they found that the hospital, well, the mortality rate was lower, and the length of stay in the hospital was significantly less, which is interesting because remember, and by the way, the people who were praying for them did not know that they weren't current. But the point is, this is what's called retrocausation, and this is an area in the consciousness studies that's being brought up now. But what was interesting is NIH had to address it, and their quote was, "No mechanism known today can account for the effects." So, now, again, we start getting into not just physical effects, but perturbating time. It's really interesting. I'm going to just breeze through Delta. Given the time. This was the final words. By the way, I had run a UFO study decades ago, one most people never heard of. It was an interagency group in that. But my last words were, in the end, it is clear that the universe is far more complex than we ever imagined. We are not close to solving the enigmas, and this is posed by UFOs or frankly any of these other areas. Rather, we're at the front end of defining the fundamental issues and the boundaries. And a century ago, I regard consciousness as fundamental. In other words, that the physical is derived from consciousness. Okay, thank you.
You stay up here. You stay up here. We'll answer questions together. And so before we take the questions then, just a very quick recap on how you can incorporate some of these ideas into a morning routine. So the placebo effect I talked about, incredibly powerful. Probably the most important technique for this is visualization. So just taking a few minutes to visualize yourself healthy and healing can be incredibly powerful. Meditation, again, even just a few minutes a day of just focusing on your breathing. When your mind wanders, just bring your mind back to the breath. Hypnosis, as I talked through earlier, use a progressive relaxation, then count down, then give yourself auto-suggestions. And hypnosis is really one of the most powerful tools, if not the most powerful tool of all. Psychedelics, again, probably the only piece of advice I can give you is to keep it legal. Nocebo. Remember to always keep a positive mental frame. And one of the best ways to do that is some form of gratitude practice, even just for 1 or 2 minutes a day. And breath work. Again, YouTube has many excellent videos for learning breath work. Something like box breathing can be good. And Wim Hof breathing, as we talked about earlier, is also very powerful. You can tap into your nervous system and so on. So thank you very much. And we can take some questions now on any of these areas that we've talked about.
Well, I might add one thing.
Yeah.
This is an article I just saw this morning, and that was on the power of positive thinking, and it is worth 7.5 years added to life between the positive and negative mental.
Yes, yeah. I seem to remember that. Yeah, I think it was Yale University. Yeah, a powerful study. So any questions from anybody?
It's okay. Right here.
What is this? It's not on. Hello. Is it on? Hello. Cleve Baxter went to burn the leaves on the plant. This is for you, sir. How come the leaves knew when he was really trying to trick him, whether he was really going to burn them or he was just pretending? And what consequence is that to us?
So when people were thinking of the leaves, would they be conscious if he was just pretending to want to burn them or really want to burn them?
I'm sorry.
So when you, in your talk, when people were thinking about burning the leaves on the plant, if they were just pretending to want to burn them versus really wanted to burn them, would it react
No,
differently?
this was Cleve, and I guess the short answer is I don't know. By the way, I left my hearing in Vietnam, so I have to have the answers repeated. But there were a whole host of things. I mean, one of the problems with most of these topics we have here, we could talk hours on any given slide. And a lot of what Cleve found was totally accidental. One was when he started by tearing the leaf or burning the leaf and physically doing it, getting a response. Then he found it just threatening him. I can't vouch for his state of mind specifically at that level. One of the things he found that was really strange was he was seeing these things die periodically and found out that it was actually attached to a urinal, and that what was happening is the cells were being killed in response to one of the experiments they did, by the way, was to take brine shrimp and they would put it over in a container, and at a random event generator they would dump it, and he would leave the laboratory, so there's nobody in the lab at that time, and then measure it, and then they would find out at the instant that the shrimp had been killed, you would see a physical response. Now, this all gets to consciousness being far more complex than anything we generally imagine, and there's a whole fields that are working on that now.
Thank you.
David Wood, did you have a question?
I just have a short, quick question. I just wanted to confirm, because I heard what you were saying earlier about testing the white cells, and I just wanted to make sure you were talking about blood cells. Is that correct? The white blood cells that you were testing? And
So you're saying when you were talking about white cells earlier, you were talking about white blood cells? Yeah.
The oral leukocytes, we're taking them from the mouth.
okay.
What you'd actually do is have people spit into a container and then use a centrifuge to concentrate the oil, and then take them out. You put electrodes into it, and then this is put in a remote Faraday cage. Fairly complex system, but and then you're you got video that's taking the exact time of the graph, and
It's fascinating. It's really amazing.
I recommend Cleve's book, Primary Perception, where he discusses a number of things.
Thank you.
Again, one of the problems that we have is talking terribly complex things and trying to address it in just a couple of minutes.
Max, I wanted to ask you about the experiments that showed that what's going on in the mind can actually change what's happening in the body. Are there examples of this in animals as well? Because it would be perhaps a good way to experiment if there was something we could do to our mice that would change their minds and we can measure it as actually them living longer. So do you have research or access to research on hypnosis or placebo effect or any of the other things in non-human animals?
Funnily enough, there is, and obviously it's more difficult to do. You can't train a mouse in self-hypnosis or meditation and so on very easily, but they have, funnily enough, done tests on placebos with animals, and there was some positive effect when the animals got sick. So I'm not even sure what the pathways of that would be, but there's also studies shown with humans that if you give them a placebo and you tell them that it's a placebo and they know it's completely inert, that can also have beneficial effects as well. I think there's even a company now that sells placebos. You can just buy a pot full of placebos, and so that's a good business model that they've got. I don't know how much they charge for those, but that's in some ways slightly similar to this. But that's the only one I know of regarding animals, David, is placebo. It would be an interesting thing to think about, how you might be able to train animals to be able to tap into these underlying resources in the mind, how to tap into the power of the mind.
Can I add one thing that relates to all of this? And that's institutional resistance, that all of these things happen. I once did a monograph on a number of all of these things that worked, they were successful, and that, like remote viewing, and that the big system comes and kills them off. So that applies to many of these areas. You have a difference between individual interest and institutional responsibility, and big systems tend to be very resistant to change.
It's interesting because mostly we're trying to get from mice to humans and talk about going from humans to mice. So, other questions?
If this works, why is the AMA or the hospital associations not adopting it and making it standard practice?
I mean, to some degree, for instance, in Britain, the NHS does have all kinds of recommendations for fairly light versions of breath work and so on. So it is making its way into mainstream healthcare. The World Health Organization did a report on the amount of sickness worldwide that is stress-related or has some kind of psychological origin. It was well over half of all illness. I don't remember the exact figure. So these ideas are slowly but surely making their way into mainstream medicine. But as John said, there's a lot of institutional inertia to all of these kinds of new ideas. So that's where hopefully this book that we're doing with Spring and Nature will be valuable, because people often think of these things as completely different areas: placebo, psychedelics, breathwork. So to have one book published by really the most elite academic publisher in the world going through all of these things will hopefully be a big step in introducing this into medical schools and into the medical establishment. But thank you, that's a very important question.
Eric, I have a little bit of a joke question. Has meditation, hypnosis, and nocebo and placebo been tested in mice and shown to have any efficacy there? And I ask this jokingly because it's been a requirement that things have to work in mice before they work in us.
Yeah, as I touched on when David asked his question, it's a very strange phenomenon, but there is evidence that placebo works with animals. I don't remember what level of animal. I believe it was dogs or something, a larger mammal. But it's very strange how that would work. But yeah, there certainly was some effect in animals. And like I said, also, if you give people placebo and tell them that they're receiving a placebo, it still will have some effect. So it's very strange, all these pathways, how it works.
I would also mention a lot of things we did with interspecies communications, particularly with dolphins and things like that, yeah, there does seem to be information transference, so that would go to a placebo makes sense.
So David, that could be perhaps the answer for how this happens with animals. Is it's not the actual placebo pill you're giving them, but some kind of psychological transference that's taking place. I'm not sure if they were double blind or whatever else was going on there, but yeah, I think it's 10-2 now. I don't know if we have time for one more question or not. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you found that interesting.